Charles, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before you get started?
Sure. I trust you'll let me know if I'm not coming through. My name is Charles Taliaferro. I've been in higher education for 40 years. I'm the author or editor of over 35 books, and I've been keen about philosophy since being a boy, and I love it. And it's great to be asked to be in an exchange with you.
Awesome. So today's topic was aesthetic experiences and God. Could you tell me more about how you got interested in that topic and what your position is in general?
Oh, okay. I was drawn to the visual arts from college days. I married a painter, and she and I began an art and philosophy reading group here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So since 1994, we've had artists and curators and philosophers meeting at our place, except for summers, and we discuss exhibits and books that are written by members of the group. The attendance varies from anywhere from 15 to 40. 40 we had right after 9/11. That was quite spectacular. But I've, by vocation, by marriage, by disposition, I initially was drawn to film, actually, and painting. I did a documentary when I was a young man. It was on PBS. So my position in aesthetics is roughly sort of abbreviating as realist. That is, I believe there really are aesthetic properties, not just affective properties like merriment, friendliness, ugliness, and so on, but I believe I'm a realist morally and aesthetically, so I believe there is beauty in ugliness, that which is truly calls on us to respond as grotesque and also to be drawn to. I've linked this with philosophy of religion, my interest there, in the sense that I've sought to see what insights can be gained from the philosophy of art as we think about philosophical theology or the philosophy of God.
How did you link those two? Like, what is the link between aesthetics and God?
We don't mince words. It's complicated. So there are a number of different respects. One is that I believe, anyway, the experience of paintings and of the world can be not just towards the five senses, but towards the affective qualities, as I suggested earlier, like beauty and ugliness and so on. And I believe that this also includes religious experience. That is the numinous. This is what Rudolf Otto had a term, the numinous mysterium tremendum and fascinans, that he documented earlier in the 20th century. Multiple cases of where persons experience the world as being transcendent or infused by a kind of spiritual reality. This can be testified anywhere from sacred texts to the Romantic poets, Blake and Wordsworth, to contemporary experience. So in a recent book, Is God Invisible?, my wife, a painter, and as well as writer, and I seek to use models of aesthetic experience in terms of understanding the experience of the divine or the sacred.
You said you use aesthetic experience to understand experiences of the divine. How so? What does that mean to use aesthetic experience to understand the divine? Like, does that relate to any aesthetic experience? And why would aesthetic experience tell you about the divine as opposed to it being a kind of a human evolutionary property?
Well, I don't think it's incompatible to be an evolutionary property that is aesthetic experience, and yet it also be something that can be transporting or disclosive in a realist fashion, just as our moral experience is, or so I suggest, certainly shaped by our biological evolution, a robust anthropology, robust understanding of what it is to be human. And similarly, it's, I believe anyway, the widespread testimony to experience the divine, which is variously described by untold numbers of people, from the mystics like Julian of Norwich, Catherine of Siena, and so on, some of the big, heavy classical figures, to ordinary people like me, who, when I go to, I'm a practicing Episcopalian, and when I and other Christian, I'm in the Christian tradition, attend the Eucharist or do a social justice action and meet with others in prayer, there can be a kind of, what shall I say, an experience that goes beyond that which is narrowly empirical, to be picked up by, let's say, everybody from Hume and Hume's progeny today in terms of the color, weight, and so on of the objects around us, towards understanding the affective life of people around us. Let's say I've been involved, even though I'm a white person, with the Black Lives Matter movement. Floyd was killed a mile and a half from where I'm broadcasting from. We had riots taking place. Our pharmacy I go to was burned down. And so I've trafficked with believing Christians and Muslims in these different communities, prayerfully and in social action, and have come to have what can be understood to be aesthetic experience of, let's say, a sense of justice or injustice, of violatory and fulfillment, as well as coupled with or infused with the experience of the sacred and the profane, that which is truly profanation, that which is distortive of other persons, and that which is fulfilling and satisfying, and what I can only say was transporting, like explaining what it is to be in love to somebody perhaps who's never felt what it is to be in love. Is very difficult to do. But if you have had an experience of awesomeness and with other persons or with natural objects, it's in that the experience of the sacred that I've sought to not capture, but point to. To capture would make it sound like one could bottle it and market it or something like that. But what I've sought to point to is something that pervades the human experience, is property of none, no single institution, but one I find emancipatory, enriching, and exciting.
So what would it mean for aesthetic experience to be real? From my position, I don't understand how it could be real, how it could be more than human construct of imagination. So what does it mean to say that aesthetic experiences exist in some sense independent of human imagination?
Well, I think we're having an aesthetic experience right now. That is, aesthetic experience can be understood in different definitions. It comes from the German meaning sense experience, but it's often used today. If you look up any guide to aesthetics, I wrote a beginner's guide to aesthetics. It's an audiobook too for any listeners out there who are interested. Aesthetic experience refers to the emotive, affective quality of things. So to experience you, for example, as being, I hope, capacious in the guest-host relationship that is welcoming me into dialogue, that is an aesthetic experience. To experience somebody as hostile or indifferent or closed-minded, that's also an aesthetic experience. So aesthetic experience would be hard-pressed to explain or describe any human experience of any significance. Even boredom and listlessness tedium. These are aesthetic qualities of events. And as for, does it take imagination to be open to this? I hate to be boring, because philosophers normally will say it depends what you mean by imagination. But if by imagination one means something that uh, goes beyond that which is immediately represented by, say, the five senses, say color, shape, and the like, then aesthetic experience would be, the fruit of imagination. But imagination here, I don't mean projection. I mean real recognition. Let's say if I'm experiencing you as hostile, and you really are hostile, that's not my mere imagination. That's grasping a real affective attitude. So I'd say friendliness, enmity, capaciousness, curiosity. Hopefully, these are modes of affective experience had by many of your viewers and listeners. I'd be hard pressed to describe even one of them to not be subject to a myriad of affective experiences right now that we might either reliably and correctly grasp or mistake.
Oh yeah, definitely understand that part. That if someone is angry or whatever, and you are believe they are angry, that's a truth statement that can be true or false and correspond to reality. But say for something like beauty, um, if you think something is beautiful, can that statement correspond to reality? Because I assume what you mean by realism is that it corresponds to reality in some sense, as true, independent of opinion. And so, what would it mean for beauty or ugliness to correspond to reality, independent of imagination? Because to me, it seems to be innately a subjective feeling that something is beautiful versus not.
Yeah, well, what I would say in terms of defining beauty and ugliness is so these are relational properties in my view. So beauty is that which ought to give rise to pleasure, aesthetic delight, and ugliness is that which ought to give rise to revulsion, disapprobation, disgust. And I would say harm and health are observable properties in other persons. So when I observe, let's say in the Black Lives Matter movement, um, a police officer essentially suffocating this Afro-American person, I am experiencing this not just in a morally neutral way, but in a way I believe to be affectively reliable. I'm actually experiencing and perceiving the harm that is being done. So I would say that just as um, it's not merely subjective to see that lacerating somebody's skin who's completely innocent for the sake of entertainment or some sick racial purity kind of mode. I think that can be viewed impartially and correctly as a deep and abiding harm to another person, as that which ought to give rise to disgust. And likewise, it strikes me that other things being equal in non-exploitative relationships, when you experience the romantic love of your partner, uh, the the goodness of a philosophical exchange among friends, this is perceivable and experienceable as something that ought to give rise to pleasure. And one can propose, or I would propose, one can argue about it. Let's say someone thinks, no, this doesn't give me any pleasure at all. And say, well, why? So come up with arguments. Say, well, I think you're being manipulative. You're not being fair. You're not being judicious to your interlocutors. You're actually being manipulative. Well, these are, it seems to me, properties that are real. Some people are manipulative, some people aren't. Some people truly are loving in the sense of wishing the good of the other person, and some people are malevolent. And I think these are not mere projections, and they're perceivable as innately desirable and they can be corrected and argued about. One can give good reasons for them and reasons against them, or so I suggest.
When you say ought to give rise these things, what if someone arguing against it, instead of saying that you're being malicious or whatever, says, I just don't get a dopamine rush from it or something, or my dopamine receptors are not very sensitive, or I have a mental condition where it doesn't produce enough dopamine, where it's simply a correspondence to a brain state in that sense, where it's not really stating that there are some objective properties to the way you're acting, but simply some physical correspondence to mental activity, and their brain just isn't working in a certain way. How do you tie that into you ought to be feeling this way? Because it sounds like you're saying that there's some state of affairs that the brain ought to release dopamine for, or something along those lines.
Yeah, well, I'm enjoying this conversation, by the way. Not that maybe that's the brain releasing a little bit of pleasure. I do enjoy philosophical exchanges. I think that there is a continuum in terms of receptivity to the properties and events that are around us that are going to have degrees. They're just as there's going to be people that are, from a technical point of view, one might say autistic or given over to sadomasochism. They find certain things arousing that others do not. And so it strikes me that there's this isn't a matter of curiosity. That is, this happens all the time. And so what I would claim, in any case, would be that with respect to the vast majority, I think, of persons, even some that might otherwise be seriously damaged, one can reason with and come to some consensus over the basic body of what I would call natural goods. Now, I think this would be, forgive me if I'm going on too long, but let me just do my best here. I'll give it, I'm granting you this. It's rooted in our biology or anthropology that there are certain goods that comprise healthy human functioning. I believe that to see, to move, to think, to reason, to have memory, these are all natural goods. They're not goods like courage, justice, temperance, and so on, though they're related deeply to them. Now, there are people that believe that their limbs and movement are actually disgusting. There are people that want to have voluntary limb amputations. There's the deaf community, the blind community, that actually want to have deaf and blind children because they have perceived certain goods to be available to them that wouldn't otherwise be there. And on these points, I don't think one can deal in a facile way, sweep them under the rug or anything like that. So I've engaged in people with, in some cases, with these conditions, and I start to argue that other things being equal, being sighted is a good, and it can be that we have a good that can. Its privation can allow persons to perceive other goods. I've sometimes amused students by saying, if you're blind, you're kind, in the sense that I've never met a blind person that wasn't kind, except once in a New York subway, and I don't think the person was really blind. The person was coming through with their stick and just hitting us. So I don't know whether, because he was pretty accurate, so I'm not sure he was blind. But I would say these deprivations can awaken us to things, sometimes being insensitive to people's immediate emotions can give one rise to a sensitivity to sonorous things like music. So I would say that there's a whole panoply of goods that we encounter. And some of us I'm blind to some, I'm sure. And this is part of the, as it were, the great conversation that needs to take place, in which one seeks to, from Socrates to the present, One seeks to engage and encounter those with whom one disagrees, even disagrees extremely strongly, and seeks to cultivate the kind of virtues of, say, patience um, and impartiality that really does allow us to kind of internalize the points of view of the involved parties and to move beyond them.
So my first thought would be symmetry. Symmetry is something that most people see as beautiful. Yet to me, it seems quite circumstantial that we see symmetry as beautiful because it's related to evolution. And if there's deteriorations in your gene, then that's indicated by certain physical deviations from one side to the other. And so I think we see it as beautiful because it benefits survival, but I don't see it as inherently beautiful. I don't see symmetry as something that is objectively beautiful. It just seems to be something that's convenient for evolution. And so we see it as beautiful. And so in this case, is there anything objectively to correspond to when we say that symmetry is beautiful? Or is it simply just a coincidence that it's beneficial to our species?
Well, see, the word beneficial is, I want to see that term as very loaded and very big. Beneficence, that which is truly good. It strikes me that having recourse to evolutionary biology it doesn't take you outside of the realm of truly objective values in the sense that you can't even understand the elements of evolutionary biology, let's say reproduction, respiration, physiology, digestion, all the properties that go and make up a healthy person. This requires value theory, and taking these on board as truly beneficent features. Reproduction would not be even a recognizable good unless we understood it to involve the replication or the emergence of something that we recognize as value. The reason why you and I value reproducing and having children whom we hope to live healthy and fulfilling lives is because we can understand them to have a good that isn't simply a projection of what we desire. Now, we may desire to get you and I to reproduce and have doctors and warriors and all kinds of very specific kind of maybe creatures that will serve us, slaves and so on. But all of this is part of the long conversation where, at one point, even as late as the 17th century, parents did think they owned their children. This was challenged, and for good reason. And what we discover, we as human beings, in our consensus-driving way, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, for example, we come to understand you and I, human beings, infants, people that have old age, as having an individual good that is not merely a reflection of societal use or prescriptions of parents. So I submit to you this notion of, you're going like symmetry. Well, it's beneficent. Well, let's talk about symmetry, symmetrical relationships like affective symmetry. A parent loves a child and a child loves the parent. Let's say that's symmetrical. That's reflexive. And presumably that reflexivity is a recognizable good. Of course, we can understand parents being abusive, and hence the parent-child dependency and what would normally be an affective, fulfilling relationship can be contorted, a matter of contortion. So in the fine print, Tom, I suggest to you and I, when we look at specific cases of evolutionary development, we can argue about that which truly is beneficent and not, quote, a mere aid to survival. Because again, survival per se is, I would say it's not a recognizable good. It depends upon the survival of what? The survival of, let's fill in, malicious hatred towards people that are different from you, people with different skin color. If do we think the survival of that is good, or survival of COVID, is that good? I would say no, because we can understand the corrosive, poisonous effect of racism, and we can understand um, viruses or parasites as being privations, like the kind of bugs that get in your eye and bring about violence, deprivation of sight. We can, as it were, see that seeing is good, and especially imagine what the willful deprivation of vision of other people, where somebody actually blinds another person for out of malice. We can see that as wrong, in
So,
my
like
view.
you mentioned respiration and reproduction. If respiration and reproduction could be replaced by alternative means to achieve the same ends, for example, I wouldn't see respiration or reproduction as being inherently valuable, and we have lost something if it was achieved by a different means. It just seems to be a convenient fact that we use this method as opposed to a different method. Or similarly, say if Hitler or somebody won, the vast majority of people may begin to see things his way, where he says whiteness is beautiful or something, and being discriminatory was beneficial to that society, and so they see discrimination as discrimination against color as equally as valuable or beautiful as discrimination against what we see as racism. And so it seems like those things, I don't know if I could say that he would be right, or one of these societies would be more factually right or wrong in that case, because it seems to be a coincidence that one values uh, acceptance of other groups and one values discrimination against other groups. Because throughout most culture, it was beneficial for one group to dislike the other group. If back when we were pygmy tribes and you saw a stranger from a different tribe, the immediate intuition was kill him, because if he goes back and finds the other tribe, they're going to take all your stuff and kill you. And so you wanted to make sure that they didn't escape. And so the ability for us to have respiration or reproduction or valuing diversity seems to be, rather than a truth statement about reality, a convenient statement about what happens to work for us. And I wouldn't say it is more valuable or more true than the alternatives necessarily.
Yeah, and I'm on the very opposite view, because I would say necessarily, yeah, mass murder and genocide are, if anything is objectively wrong, mass murder and genocide are. Um,
Well,
on
so I would agree with you there, because I'm also a moral realist, but I wouldn't agree with to say that they are not necessarily objectively beautiful. So, because there are many art forms, movies, paintings, depictions of war and genocide, like the Holocaust monument, that I would say are very beautiful. It's a very beautiful monument, even though it depicts these things. And so I wouldn't say that those things are inherently abhorrent or unbeautiful. And so it wouldn't be objectively the case that there is that it's not beautiful to see depictions or representations of these things.
Okay, well, let me give me 2 minutes to respond. On reproduction, let me just think about this. Um, okay, I'm just going to be thinking out loud, and because time is limited, I'm just going to barrel in. I am inclined to think that reproduction, including um, sexual reproduction, is a foundational good, of comprising of what it is to be human. Now, I'm also very typical kind of progressive Christian. I believe in legitimacy of single-sex unions. In fact, I officiated a wedding of a lesbian couple, both of whom are seeking to reproduce, but artificially. And so they believe actually reproduction is a good, even though they're doing asexual reproduction. They're having sex for sure, and they're reproducing, but it's going to be through artificial insemination and the like. But I do think that sexual reproduction, other things being equal, ceteris paribus, unless you're a praying mantis, is a good, and that sometimes when we seek goods that are surrogate in a way, like adoption. I believe that that is a way of simulating that which would be, again, I may need to revise this as we go along, a natural good. That is, friends of mine that have adopted children or that are adopted, it seems to me that they seek to, as it were, own, not in terms of property, their parents as truly their parents, the equivalent of their biological parent, even if biological reproduction hasn't been involved. So I'd say biological reproduction, I would go on paper to say, I think is a basic good. And that that doesn't mean that adoption is perverse or less than good, that it could be that adoption has certain good qualities and great making properties that actually natural reproduction doesn't have. Adoption can have the good of actually rescuing a child that might otherwise perish. So there can be all kinds of goods involved. But on the Hitler thing, I would say if you dig in to these cases, you see actually the Nazis themselves sought to cover up the Holocaust. You look at what Himmler and I have the website on ethics where some of his discussions with the SS, where he explicitly comes to see whether what they're doing is absolutely morally horrifying. He believes it's justified because of racial purity. He believes that there's some justificatory good involved. But I think that we both know, listeners know, that biological racism of the kind that Hitler advanced is bad biology. It's not just morally grotesque, but it doesn't succeed. So, but I would say on the Holocaust Museum, I'm sorry, Tom, I'll wrap this up. So I would say the Holocaust Museum is complicated because on the one hand, it is objectively grotesque, the killing, the mass murder of these people. However, there are certain goods that can be outweigh the display of horror, namely education, also veneration. There's a way in which I might be brought to venerate an ancestor who was killed at Auschwitz by kneeling in Auschwitz, by actually seeking to if let's say these photographs of the victims were Nazi photographers. So in a way, this is a highly controversial matter today of Holocaust studies, because when we look at these pictures, we're looking at the victimizers' photographs of these people, but it might still be a good to behold these pictures insofar as that is able to give rise to or cultivate a kind of allegiance or love or compassion for those who lost their lives, to ensure that this never happens again, and also as a tribute to love.
Well, yeah. So I would go a step further and say that there are forms of art that are depicting of very grotesque things, but in and of themselves can be very beautiful. So, like scary movies, horrifying video games, the Holocaust Museum. Like people can be there and feel the same sensations of beauty that they get from the Mona Lisa or the great art, the great churches that are built. It seems like the sensations that are brought about by depictions of those events can be equally as much a form of art that can be relished in a sense of beauty as any other form of art. And in the case of reproduction, if we say there was an alternative form of reproduction, instead of it being sexual reproduction, it was more like eating cheeseburgers. If you ate a cheeseburger, you became pregnant or something along those lines. Would comparing those two worlds, would one of them have a greater good than another? I wouldn't necessarily say so. I say that tying in one positive thing to another, like having children with sexual reproduction, which you enjoy, could be considered a good. But if we tied it into a different pleasurable thing like eating or enjoying a movie or something, and if that action led to pregnancy, that would equally be as much of a good. And so I don't see the connection between sexual reproduction and children as necessarily a good. It just happens to be convenient that this is the method that we use.
Oh, wow. Okay, let me try to. Well, in fact, to go to your point at first, there was at least one Greek poet who Greece was rather misogynist, and this was a male, and he said, "Why do we actually have to have intercourse with women to have children? Why can't we just go to a temple and pray, and then an infant would appear on the altar? Why that?" And I'd say that here I'm a sensualist, I would say. I think that maybe this is John Stuart Mill, try these different goods. And I've eaten a lot of hamburgers. I'm not going to talk to you about what I've experienced in sensually, but I would say that no matter how good a hamburger is, no matter how succulent, it's not it may be an incommensurate good towards the good of sexual union. But if you haven't tried sexual union recently, I highly recommend it. And when it's done voluntarily among consensual adults, it will be, to describe it as it's like eating a hamburger, but just really good. I would say it's a very non-hamburger experience. Just like it would be really weird just if you're eating a hamburger and say, wow, this is as great as making love. This is like amazing. I would say these are competing goods. And I think I have the weight of much human poetry and literature on my side. And I think what is also on my side is when things go horribly wrong. When Oedipus realizes he was having intercourse with his mother, and then he blinds himself, and actually she severs her breast, and all this. We wouldn't find this tragic unless we realized that blinding somebody is bad, severing the breast. We wouldn't understand it also unless we understood that sexual union was a good, and what was being despoiled in this tragedy was that it involved, we could argue about evolution and taboos and so on, but a violation of the parent-child relationship. So I would suggest that if we, in a debate, we would, like the hamburger versus making love, it seems to me that one can address such examples, and when one understands, no matter how good the hamburger, and if the making love truly is consensual, etc., these are competing goods that are of objective, should give rise to relish. Now, in terms of sexual union, there are matters of privacy and intimacy. There's going to be variation among cultures and so on. But all of this would need to be argued with in terms of detail.
Well, are you saying that the level of pleasure of the action and its association to having children is what makes it good? So if there was an action that you enjoyed more than sex, and if that was associated with having children, then it would be better than sex being associated with having children?
On this point, I regard pleasure as actually not a single sensation. But pleasure has to do, in my view, with preference satisfaction. And I believe there are different kinds of satisfaction and different kinds of preferences. Differences in kind, not just differences in degree. Like there might be a difference in degree between a whisper and a scream, you call it volume. But in terms of the pleasure that I have in making love, in versus nutrition, versus in a good conversation with my students, with my colleagues, these are different kinds. And I want to use the technical term, they're incommensurate. That is, they do not admit of comparing on the same scale. Like if I say, well, this Rembrandt painting, how much is it worth to you? How many friendships would you exchange with it? And I'd say, no, we're in the middle of incomparable goods. Sometimes tough decisions need to be made, but so I would say the preference of I'm childless, so I've not had a child, so I can't really speak to it personally. But I imagine that the good that I would have by having a child with a mate would be. It's something that well, I'll put it personally. I missed. I would have loved to have had that, and it doesn't substitute the pleasure of, say, being an author. I once I got one of my first publications. It came out, and I was holding it like this, and the secretary said, "Charles, you're holding it like it's a baby." I thought, oh my gosh, and I thought, oh my God, I hope not. But I would trade, 15 books for the pleasure of actually being a parent. Not because it's the degree, but it's a different kind. I will die without ever having known this, and I can't measure it in terms of degree.
So, but would the kind make a difference, therefore, its relation to having a child? So, for example, the kind of joy from sexual intercourse versus the kind of joy from, let's say, deep philosophical debate. Say pregnancy was a result of deep philosophical debate instead of sexual intercourse. Would one of those worlds have a greater goodness factor or a greater aesthetic factor than the other? I don't think I could say they would. I'd say that it would be equally as valuable, probably from the perspective of different people, to have one form over the other. And I don't think there's one is more inherently right or beautiful than the other.
Well, I somewhat wonder whether this is generational. I have put the following. So just to put my cards on the table, I was born in 52, so I'm going to be 70 this month, and you look like a young fellow, perhaps in your 30s or wherever you are. And what I put to students is the following thought experiment. If you'll indulge me here, I'll say, imagine two couples, and they both equally love each other, maybe make them non-gender specific, whatever they are. And imagine they both are married, but let's say they both die on Monday night. But this one couple has actually had the good of sexual intercourse, and the other has not. They've had the good of, let's say, climbing a mountain together, or to use their example, a deep philosophical discussion. And I said, does the one have a good that the other doesn't have? And my students, okay, so I mentioned I've been in higher education for 40 years, but when I've used this thought experiment, and I've only done it like a handful of times, but in the last, say, 10 years, in my 50s, late 50s and early 60s, students have routinely said, no, it's not the case that you can, from the outside looking in, think that the couple that actually had sexual union had a good that the other didn't have. And I think that could well be, this could be a matter of relativity. I hate to sort of end on this level, and hopefully we're not at the end. But and it might be, I mentioned this with a colleague, and said, look, today with students, it's a hookup culture. And intercourse just doesn't have the significance it had for me, born in 52 in the 60s and 70s. Just even if, it'd be kind of weird, even intimate kissing was like the equivalent to me of, this is like a commitment. This is like major. So it can be, I'm going to grant that it might be that my intuitions are culturally saturated in this respect. Though I am not going to hold out that because of the good that even my students, even you, hold towards sexual union, we regard as its violation, namely rape, as especially horrific. And versus having a clumsy philosophical conversation or a clumsy mountain climbing experience where, you're kind of reckless and you're not really. No, we regard when something goes wrong in the bedroom, this is you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable. There's been a violatory moment that can be lifelong in terms of the injuries, that less so in these other cases. And
I would disagree with that. So,
okay.
So in the case, I wouldn't say it as simply being bad at rock climbing. I would say, like, if you forced someone to go rock climbing with you, that's kidnapping. That'd be kidnapping and life endangerment, putting someone on a mountain. Or if you forced someone to be into a deep intellectual conversation that they couldn't disengage from, it'd be like kind of mind reading or forcing yourself into somebody's mind, which I think would be equally as horrific as rape, in that sense that there are many sci-fi TV shows that go into the horrors of what it's like to be a psychic, and if you can enter someone else's mind without their consent, I think that would be equally as much of a violation as rape in that case. So I think that if you're forcing someone into these situations in a non-consensual way, it's understood to be just as bad as sexually forcing someone into those situations, because your mind and having someone enter your mind without your consent would be quite traumatizing.
You come up with a forceful example. These me, and so if we were on a timer, I might like to just say pause and really think this one through. But because we're on a timer, I'm going to barrel ahead, and I'm going to suggest to you that we may have a disagreement here, and so my counter would be this: that is, in the case of a primordial, more aboriginal harm that is done, such that is more foundational than, I would suggest, the kidnapping case is a really good one. The manipulation case, those are really good but what I want to suggest is that they are almost achieve their power partly the more aberration that we would feel if we violated. Let me give you a quick example. Jesse Ventura, our governor, here in Minnesota years and years ago, to a memorial service for Wellstone, who died in a plane crash. And the Wellstone Memorial Service turned out to be kind of like a political rally. And his son, and Ventura left, and you know what? I felt raped when I was there. I went to a memorial service and I felt raped. Now, what I would suggest to you, no, this gets a topsy-turvy. I have not physically been raped, but people that are very dear to me have been. Is the experience of rape, as I've witnessed from a distance, is very, very different from the victim of going to a political rally when you thought you were actually to a memorial service. One is students actually will use this sort of rape on exams. They'll say, that exam was so pathetic. Now, that could be a sign that generationally, my intuitions are much more old, and transient. But my inclination is still to think there is a residual aboriginal notion that the reason why we find kidnapping so horrifying is it's is rapacious. It is taking somebody's autonomy and ripping it asunder. And it may not involve an actual penetration and violation of intimate cavities in one's anatomy, but I would say that violations of cavities and orifices and so on has a kind of basic, the basic violations are Aboriginal. I don't think I've given you an argument. I've just been more maybe.
Well, I think I understand it though,
But
so from my perspective, I can understand why, because sex is so important to our culture, that it would be seen as more basal, more Aboriginal. But because I'm so into sci-fi, I'm very, very into sci-fi. If we imagined a society that was uh, reproduced through psychic interactions, through going into somebody else's mind instead of a physical interaction of sex, and they communicated through psychic transmissions, and that was the core of their society, was built around this rather than physical interaction. I could understand how, from their perspective, invading their mind without their consent would be equally as bad, or they would see it as equally as bad as we see rape is from our perspective, and that it seems like it's culturally bound to what happens to be the core of our beings, and that if our beings operated in a different way, like in a psychic community, they would understand the psychic interactions to be equally as significant as we understand the physical interactions to be.
wow. Yeah, okay. I appreciate your points. I'm just looking at the comments too. Just like, wow, all kinds of comments over there.
Yeah, ignore so fun fact about YouTube:
Wow.
suggestion, ignore the comments. Just always ignore the comments.
Okay. I too enjoy sci-fi. I'm a little bit more into fantasy of like Lord of the Rings type of stuff. I just wrote a Narnia Chronicles of C.S. Lewis and so on. So I'm a bit more into magic, but I am into Star Wars and have actually done some publishing on all people. So I'm into this. However, I think what's sci-fi is extremely instructive. It can make limber our intuitions, make us more open to, say, artificial intelligence, how being actually intelligent. All these things can be mind expanding, important resources for philosophical investigation. So I will, though, still, namely, and this is odd, because if you read my other work, I'm a materialist. So I believe material bodies, the physical world exists, but I also believe in actually the soul, consciousness. There's more to us than theological physics, biology, and chemistry. So I believe in consciousness, etc., etc. So, okay. But for all of my emphasis on the soul, and I've written a brief history of the soul, etc., etc., also an audiobook, if any of interested. But there is still this. Let's take intimate kissing. I want to suggest to you that this is a profound cross-cultural, perceivable, observable, that is, good, subject to scientific artifacts, but there is some evidence to believe that, for example, that which is firstly regarded as a matter discussed, is spitting on another person, taking your spitting, and it's sometimes used but it's to ward off evil spirits. So it's understood to be to get rid of the evil. So the counterexample hold up and guard really primordial. Spitting on somebody else, that's bad. But what is intimate? It involves sharing the saliva of a person. I want to suggest to you that is extraordinary when you do that with another being. The kind of intimacy. Now, it might be in the sci-fi world there could be a surrogate or an we would the word surrogate would suggest it's a shadow of the real. I realize that's plays in my side and your side, but I think that as we in the subway and you're reading your sci-fi and he spits on you, you're going to, other than being equal, unless you're part of a wedding, you're going to go like, what the F are you doing? Because it's just as it's up with urinating or defecating on a person. And there might be deep epistemiological reasons why we find this hellfire choice. But I think these are deep and profound. And bodily life is full of waste. We wouldn't be in, or I'm in a home unless we controlled waste. This is biology, this is evolution, etc. But it's also understanding of beauty and this, that it's beautiful to speak with you and not for you not to speak, and vice versa. And these are, I believe, perceivable, beautiful events that we've been engaged in. We may not be able to reproduce a child as a result of this conversation, but perhaps we've slated somebody out there to for themselves to try reproducing.
For sure.
I've lost it.
Well, we have been almost going for about an hour, so it is almost time to wrap up. But do you think there is anything more intimate than sex? So, for example, if in the future we could go or join minds in a sense where we could have our consciousness join together in some way, I think that would be far more intimate than sex would be, or far more intimate than kissing would be. I think that would be the peak of what intimacy could be, as if we could join our consciousness in some sense. And I would see that as far more meaningful or far more good than, for example, physical interactions like sex. And if that could take place, if reproduction was associated with that rather than sexual reproduction, I would see that as if there were goods of some kind, I would see the joining of consciousnesses as a greater good that we would associate childbearing or child rearing to rather than sex. And so I don't see sex as particularly spectacular compared to what that would be like.
Boy, you really, me not to look at the chat. That was somebody said, I don't understand Charles at all. Just like, wow. Okay, whatever. Perhaps your mates. You may be right. Why oppose it? I'll though in closing suggest that among the more intimate portraits of fulfillment that we find in the spiritual literature, end of the Divine Comedy of Dante, Beatrice and experiencing the one, or Saint Therese in the ecstasy of being. A lot of these images describe unitive experiences. They often use from mysticism or from the songs and the like. So I'd say, given our current embodiment, I want to end with a suggestion. Sexual intimacy, it does take a certain kind of primacy for me and perhaps others to other possibilities, given different forms of embodiment and different permutations in terms of the porous are interrelated with each other, that opens up new possibilities.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Oh, thanks. If you go to the St. Olaf College, OLAF College site, under emeritus professors, or just Charles Taliaferro, spelled Taliaferro, and put profile, and you'll list of my publications, audiobook. I've been on TV a fair amount, a show called Engineering as a philosopher, analyzing ads. So you can find various links there.
Awesome. I'm also in Minneapolis, Minnesota, just in case you were unaware. And if you happen to know of any like interesting philosophical chat groups, please send Jeff an email where I can check them out, because I'm always looking for more interesting people to meet as much as possible.
This art and philosophy group that we have going might be right up your alley. We're going to start up again in October, and I'll send you an invite through.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.